Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 4, Forgotten Dark. Deep beneath the earth were concealed great rooms and broad halls, expansive enough to easily beggar belief. Their cavernous ceilings vaulted so high torchlight could scarcely reach, and monstrous walls extending out into unassailable darkness. It was through these incomprehensibly vast spaces Michael Irons with calm caution strode. He saw no trace of life, nor even dust. The impossible architecture which reached away and loomed overhead seemed locked within a distant time, old enough to be forgotten, found, and forgotten again. The near silent impact of his well-worn leather boot soles upon the onyx marble floors, rather than reverberating, were instead swallowed by the great emptiness contained around him. To the unlearned eye of Irons, the intentional space and intricate embellishments most resembled an alien fusion of proud Baroque and effervescent Renaissance, rendered strangely aquatic to the eye. A dark and profound capriccio, torn from imagination and carved into reality. To consider any human hand, living or dead, can conceive this, let alone produce. The very notion seemed impossible. Within a few hours into the dark, Michael Irons became well convinced this place had been formed by some ancient, prehistoric civilization. Its people perhaps brought low by disease, seeing as his utterly untouched surroundings did not imply a violent end. And yet, after wandering for what he presumed were eventually days, Irons never found skeletons or remnants of any kind. There were no cracks, no dust, no destruction or decay. He even began to notice there was no evidence this place housed a people at all. There were no living quarters, no kitchens, no storage rooms, nothing to sustain an occupation, military or civilian. And with these macabre surroundings, next he pondered if this were a place of pagan worship or perhaps burial. Yet he found no altars or monuments, no graves, no markings, no sarcophagi. Irons wondered as his eyes were drawn up one of the numerous monolithic support columns which rose overhead like some primordial forest. What purpose had this place served? Then, by now well accustomed to the perfect silence, Irons felt, rather than heard, the impression of a sound ahead. On instinct, he drew his flintlock pistols, and his already near silent step became wolf-pad quiet. Before even 20 paces passed, Irons became convinced there was combat ahead. His pace quickened. For a time, the sound before Irons did not grow, yet experience assured him his direction was correct. The cavernous space around him seemed to focus as side routes and alternative corridors grew less frequent than absent. When the sound of battle finally became distinct, Michael Irons found the hallway to have at some point become a single room. The ceilings themselves grew high enough to disappear from the lamplight Irons bore, turning the space above him into an inscrutable sea of darkness. The great support columns vacated the open floor and were now pushed into the walls, making them appear more decorative than functional. Irons wondered if perhaps this had been the case all along. Finally, suddenly, Irons turned a corner and could see the far wall of this impossible cathedral-like cavern. Strangely, that far wall was smooth, clean, and as white as polished ivory, stark against the dark surroundings. Within the white wall was juxtaposed a narrow, jagged scar of darkness, torn up from the ground, climbing, narrowing, then concluding where the white wall began to darken into the shadows above. And inside that breach, rising from the ground but ceasing before piercing even a fifth of the dark rift's distance, there seemed to be nestled the narrow needle of a structure, its color white like the wall. Considering the distance, Irons reckoned the structure must have been 50 feet tall at least, and the scar of darkness wide enough to accommodate the easy passage of 5 frigates sailing abreast. and the reasons why Irons could discern any of this so far from his lantern's meager light. An eerie, unearthly illumination emanated ahead. It was a strange light, somehow soft despite the vast space it traversed, its hue continuously folding, fluctuating, slowly shifting color between a dark, sickly yellow-green and a clear, blue-tinged white light, almost as if the disparate colors vied against one another for dominance. Whatever the source, it remained yet unseen. The glow emanated from a collection of low structures which seemed clustered before the white wall. Their stark silhouettes imitated the sharpness of the onyx architecture Irons had come to expect. This was also where the sounds of battle originated. At silent speed, Michael Irons closed the distance. Eventually, he could discern the clash of individual weapons. A dozen combatants, perhaps one or two more, but the cadence of the struggle seemed odd. As he drew near, Irons mindfully kept the shadows cast by the thick, long, strange onyx structures. While no dead ends hindered him, the tight and abrupt arrangements nevertheless felt distinctly maze-like. Considering the ubiquitous and inhuman precision of this place, Irons wondered if the purpose of this arrangement could only be discerned from a high vantage. Eventually, Irons passed from the strange structure's streets and approached a series of mighty pillars and arches he could only describe as being similar to that of a pantheon, also onyx. It formed a precise half-circle, each side concluding just before reaching the white wall, its arc easily encompassing the dark scar. Inside this border, where Irons may have expected steps, was instead a large, slow depression which dropped away from Irons, forming a wide, shallow, smooth depression. Its surface that of polished ivory in the same manner as the white wall which loomed high overhead. The bold surface was half contained within the pantheon, while its other half extended into the great breach Irons had observed, its position perfect and pristine, as if all else, chasm and pantheon alike, had been later formed around it. And rising from the far side of the circle, extending up and out into the breach, sharply struck a narrow staircase, also the color of polished ivory, nearly luminescent against the dark scar's depths. This was the needle-like structure Irons had seen from afar, and resting atop this protrusion, on a dais hardly wider than the stairs, was something Irons could only describe as a throne, simple and modest, but its regal bearing unmistakable. Together with the stairs, it seemed to form the image of a white arrow thrusting into the darkness. However, strange and wondrous as this throne was, it was not allowed to hold the eye of Irons for long. Within the bowl's middle was a flat circle. Within this expansive space, 24 figures, all armed with simple spears, pursued one man. Each spearman was encased in armor reminiscent of the onyx architecture. All 24 moved with unnerving uniformity in each motion, and all of it, while steady and even-handed, was executed stilted and strangely slow. That is, if one who possessed no ability or training were to fight 4 such foes, he would be swiftly slain. But if a man were an accomplished apprentice with the blade, such a person might manage to defeat half a dozen of these strange foes. And should a dozen onyx-clad soldiers fall upon a master of the blade, one steeped in knowledge and extensive experience, they would be turned aside with relative ease. 24, however. The man who fought against the onyx spearmen appeared neither young nor old, and his skin was tanned with travel, making a guess to his origins difficult. His long black hair was unkempt, whether by travel or this combat could not be seen. He clothed himself with simple weathered garments, none strange to be seen on a traveler. However, each article seemed to originate from a different nation, and each piece appeared to have endured multiple years of travel and hardship. The jackets and shirt were absent their elbows, the trousers lacked knees, and both boots bore neither laces nor buckles. The left shoe's toes had even come away from its sole, flopping about in what would have been a comical fashion, if not for this vagabond's dire state. However, most notable and strange was that the traveler wielded a great war axe, the likes of which Michael Irons had never before seen. The entire weapon was crafted from some strange white metal, its form bearing no evidence of breaks, welds, or fractures. This, thought Irons, would be a monstrously heavy weapon, more appropriate to the wars of yore, allowing its bearer to hew his way through the melee like a berserker. And now that the weapon's size and potential weight had been registered in his mind, Irons took another look at the traveler and saw that, while hunched from exhaustion, should the man be upright, he would have stood head and shoulders above not only his enemies, but Irons as well. His long arms and legs were corded with dense, lithe muscle, from which he seemed to coax uncanny speed, strength, and clearly great stamina as well. Indeed, it was unclear for how long the vagabond had been locked in this mortal struggle, though exhaustion seemed to have forced the vagrant to act in a purely defensive manner. How he managed to even swing such a large weapon prompted Irons to wonder if perhaps the axe were somehow lighter than it appeared. Still, despite his emotional inclination to jump to the outnumbered man's aid, Irons was torn between this instinct and consideration of the unknowns. After all, the Wanderer seemed out of place, perhaps an adventurer but just as likely a grave robber, while those he fought with their intricate onyx-colored armor seemed to be of this place. But the large man's axe, being of similar coloring to the arena and throne, could also imply belonging. And the fluid, intuitive skill with which the weapon was wielded said he and it were well familiar, not a random piece grasped of happenstance and desperation. What Irons also began to notice was how the broad-shouldered vagabond seemed loath to withdraw from the great central circle, as if guarding it, while the armored assailants, thus far seemingly unable to slay him, moved to contain and herd the large man, apparently intent on forcing him from the ring. All the while, one or two of these onyx soldiers would sometimes break pursuit and begin to kneel upon the flat circle, to what end Irons could not see, at which point the ragged man would gather what strength he could and disrupt the action. Even these outbursts seemed to be made in defense of the circle itself and were limited to mere interruptions. As the fight moved about towards the perimeter once more, now Irons could see that within the circle was in fact a raised seal, the swords, shields, and crests upon it he assumed to represent whatever empire or kingdom built this place. This seal seemed to have been cast and carved in what appeared to be iron or some similar compound, since it was brown and green with centuries of rust, and had even accrued thick layers of dust or sand. This was the first evidence of time's passage Irons had found in this strange place. But, strangest of all was that it was from this seal the sickly green and soft blue lights emitted as if dawn's light through a window encrusted by dust or frost, despite the seal itself remaining solid iron. Then, finally, suddenly, the vagabond managed to jab out with a vicious stab of his great axe, the thrust catching an enemy in the helmet. The struck helm shattered in a cascade as if porcelain, revealing the armor absent of an occupant. Then, while the disparate pieces fell, they disintegrated further and further until, rather than a corpse collapsing, only a fine sand drifted down upon the seal. The same fine sand Irons had noticed strewn about the seal and first presumed to be dust. This revelation of the onyx-clad soldiers being little more than golems stunned Irons, and he began to assume they were guardians of this place, but then he noticed the seal move. There were small ripples to start, like a small rock dropped on the surface of a puddle. The fight wore on. The constructs were either oblivious or indifferent to this development, while the strange man's efforts seemed to grow more frenetic, even fearful. The ripples began to gather, and where they met were created small mounds rising and falling, each just larger than a fist, as if the ancient metal were becoming as malleable as dough and something were attempting to push through. The tarnished seal continued to deform and warp, cracking the green and brown corrosion, shedding the centuries of rust until the seal shone with immaculate polish. The struggle of the light's hues, released from the rust, were now cast bright upon the wall, their slow interaction growing intensified and agitated in conjunction with the seal's increasingly disturbed surface. until the alien metal itself began to sing and wail in a discordant cacophony, shrieking sharp and pained, as its grossly engorged surface was warped by the invasive strain. Now the rising movements seemed to draw towards the center, joining there in a concerted effort, forcing the metal upward until it was wafer-thin, pulled taut over the apparent source of this force. Irons saw therein a form similar to that of a human hand, but the size was too great, the fingers too long, the flesh too gaunt, its nails more akin to claws. From just this half-hidden glimpse, Irons felt a deep and dreadful revulsion, as if that grotesque hand had just passed cold and clammy against his brain. Something deeper than instinct threatened to make him retch as his entire body, mind, and soul recoiled. Then, one of the onyx-armored automatons moved into the seal's center as before, and now Irons clearly saw. It reached out towards that foulness in assistance. Whatever dwindling uncertainty Michael Irons carried was banished like mist before a sudden and desperate fire. He fled into the white bowl without consideration, dread momentarily driving thought from his mind. As he closed upon the skirmish, both flintlock pistols of his were raised and fired, shattering 2 of the onyx automatons. Both crumbled, disintegrating into dust as he dropped his pistols and withdrew his great longsword. He fell upon the enemies at the vagrant's right, relieving the pressure put upon his impromptu ally's flank, though he mindfully kept himself at a distance so both he and the vagabond could wield their respective weapons without fear for the other warrior's well-being. The haggard warrior, no longer overwhelmed, wordlessly bellowed a fresh challenge and moved forward with renewed brutality. His great axe finally allowed the space to cleave brutal arcs, shattering armor and weapons with a revitalized gusto. As the onyx constructs crumbled, Irons immediately noticed a change in those that remained. Now, when an enemy fell, their dust was drawn towards the seal's edge as if by magnetism, and the seal, upon receiving the particles, in turn became less agitated, more firm, and as it solidified, the grotesque yellow-greens in the light grew less violent, less frequent, and became gradually overwhelmed by the blue-tinged white glow. The onyx opponents also seemed to lose power, their forms becoming less and less defined, as if mud melting under rain. First, the intricate details on their armor swiftly disappeared. Then all definition between armor plates vanished. By the time half a dozen foes had been slain, the enemy were rendered featureless, their entire form smoothed into unbroken uniformity, until even what had passed for their helmets' visors sunk away, replaced by empty spaces, hollow holes leading into seemingly bottomless sockets. When only 6 remained, they also began to grow weaker and even slower than before, until, finally, only one enemy remained, appearing to be nothing but a semi-animate lump of gray mud, vaguely upright on what might have been interpreted as legs. It stood almost motionless, pulsing minutely, as if imitating breathing. But Irons still felt from the depths of those eye-like holes a dreadful intent and alien malice. With a great final overhead strike and a mighty cry of exhausted triumph, the vagrant barbarian brought his axe crashing down, messily cleaving the clay-like form in twain. Michael Irons watched as the final strands of sand were drawn with purpose towards the now firm seal, gathering at its sides, as if trying to get beneath the great metal circle. And it seemed to be succeeding, for there was soon less and less of it, until the last grain vanished, and, with a final, slow, serene ripple from its center moving out, the strange seal became utterly solid once more. The ethereal light, its clear blue-tinged color unmolested, remained, dancing merrily about the vast space, playfully teasing toward the dark reaches which remained in the shadow. Irons felt a nudge at his shoulder and turned. The vagabond gestured for him to vacate the seal, then further indicated with a finger to withdraw out of the bowl and to its perimeter pantheon. Now that there was no immediate danger, Irons was allowed his first close inspection of this stranger. The man was perhaps 30 at most, yet his eyes and bearing communicated a greater unknowable understanding, something Irons could only describe as regal. In response to the gestured instructions, Irons graciously, perhaps instinctively, bowed, then sheathed his blade, retrieved his pistols, and removed himself from the seal in the depression. As he reached the Pantheon, Irons heard a wordless call from behind. He turned and saw the vagabond gesture towards him again, moving his hand in a way many cultures use to indicate the desire for one to hold fast. Out of respect for his comrade in arms and his own curiosity, Irons obliged. Below, the strange vagabond stood at the center of the large seal, face upturned towards the high throne. Then he lifted his axe and thrust its butt downward upon the seal. A bright, uneven note emitted from the strike, haunting, slowly moving back and forth between a true sharp and true flat, but never quite settling on either. The soft, blue-tinged white light erupted into a great beam so strong and complete that it looked as tangible as water. Before Irons could even begin to recover his amazement, the fount of light calmed enough to be easily looked upon, though its intensity still appeared almost physical. Within, the traveler could be seen standing strong, unchanged, both hands still gripping his axe. Then the weapon began to be taken within the seal. It did not melt, but simply seemed to be drawn down into water. And while it descended from the perimeter of the seal, rose in unison an array of weapons, no two the same, all of them constructed of a light like that of the seal's. It was here that Michael Irons sensed a presence, and he turned to look behind, then raised his eyes. There were giants. They appeared to be manifestations of the same energy, but even more hearty, seeming akin to a liquid marble which moved and shifted within and upon itself like molten rock. Yet Irons felt strangely certain that if he were to touch one, his hand would pass through the form as if it were mist. Despite this intangibility, their immense forms marched forward with an inevitable and timeless weight. As he watched, these figures totaled 17, a number which matched the count of weapons about the seal, passed by him and stood shoulder to shoulder in a half circle within the Pantheon, observing the stranger who still stood within the pillar of light. There was a great gravitas in their featureless bearings, a stoic nobility any culture would recognize, and Irons felt, perhaps even comprehended, that these were the aspect of past kings, come to recognize another. As if on cue, the traveler moved forward from the seal. When he left, the light ceased, though the weapons and the giant forms remained, creating more than adequate illumination. Then the vagabond began to climb the steps towards the throne. He had ascended but 10 steps when one of the weapons leveled itself, aimed towards the man's back. Then from the giant's ranks one of the great figures shattered, its coremost elements resolving into a distinct human form, ornately armored in regalia Irons scarcely believed possible. This figure moved from its place in the half-circle and gripped his spectral weapon as if for action. With the inexplicable clarity of a dream, Irons understood. The vagabond was heir and king to an ancient and extinct race, come to claim the throne, and to, in turn, be claimed by the duty it represented. "Godspeed," Michael Irons intoned, and inclined his head toward the vagrant king, humbled to bear witness. The near-transparent specter of the long-dead king gripped his weapon, a brutal sword with a long rectangular blade. Then the figure shot away faster than a diving falcon and smote the ascendant king. Both specter and weapon broke upon the man like water, the blue energies washing over him like heavy smoke. The vagabond king lurched under the blow as if a physical sword had struck him, while his rags tore and ripped as if from a mighty wind. But the king caught himself, neither knee nor palm touching a stair, and he continued to climb. One after another, each distinct weapon was leveled, and its uniquely decorated king emerged. Each weapon was claimed, the specter shot forward, and the ascendant king was struck. Then the next, and the next, and the next, the blue-white energy of each crushing against the vagrant king, until his legs shook, and every step came tenuous and uncertain. But still the king climbed towards the throne. Throughout this trial, Irons noticed that upon each strike, a glow shone from the king's right hand. This grew and grew until, even from his distant vantage, Irons could see the source to be a ring which now glowed with a blue-white fire, a fire which only intensified the more weapons and spirits were smote upon the king. Finally, his entire frame shaking as if from the lash of a slaver's whip, the king drew himself to the peak of the stairs and stood before the throne. One final weapon, a great spear of simplistic, brutal construction, its blade as great as its haft, remained. The king took the final step to the throne, standing as tall as his new burden allowed, his ring hand trembling from the blue fire which wreathed and ate yet refused to consume his flesh. He stood before the throne but a moment. Irons could not see his face. The king sat. The final weapon angled and the final specter emerged, a barbarian king, nearly a giant himself, clad in naught but a loincloth bearing no crown save an unadorned leather band. Without hesitation, the final blow was unleashed. The shock from the strike released an almost electric energy which reached even to Irons, and the hairs on his arms stood with static charge. The stricken king, clothes long since shredded from his Herculean form, went rigid upon his throne as if impaled by lightning, his wide eyes emitting bright white light. Then it was over. The king's form slumped upon the throne, and the seal below dimmed until its glow came slight and muted, its dim light shifting upon the walls, making the underground kingdom seem submerged. Irons blinked in the fresh, near darkness until his bedazzled eyes could refamiliarize themselves with the dim light. He looked up towards the throne above. The vagabond king had stood and begun to descend the stairs, his body glowing softly in the dark. Eventually, the king stood upon the seal once more, and his eyes radiated with light. The nameless king beckoned to Irons, who approached. While the king was physically no larger, the aura which emanated from him was overwhelming. Whoever he had once been was no more, subsumed into the manifestation of a purpose. Even as Irons watched, there seemed to be occasional ashes lifting from his form. A mortal body could not hold the powerful multitude, and even now began to burn away. The king removed his ring. It no longer glowed and appeared as ordinary burnished silver. This he handed to Irons, who took it. Then the king spoke, his voice tinged with the resolute weariness of a long-fought war, yet still the words were uttered with confident strength. A veteran king in the face of final glory. He spoke in a language long forgotten, and the unknown words emerged in a chorus of 18 voices, each speaking all at once in different languages. 2 of these contained devolved fragments of Saxon roots, and 3 others held formative rudiments from which the Romantic languages had sprung. Somehow, Irons felt meaning parsed and understood. For your aid, in the reinforcement, we thank thee. For your witness to our efforts, we are grateful. Now we entreat your safe return to the world with what blessing we may manage, and request you bear our ring to that space. Speak not of us, simply release the ring as it wishes. It will seek and be found. The cycle will turn, the seal will be maintained. The union of kings held within the nameless vagabond's body looked upon Michael Irons with royal graciousness. Their posture sagged as the body drew near death. Then it immolated in soft blue fire gently. What ashes fell burned to cinders, then to oblivion, and Michael Irons was once again alone in the dark beneath the earth.